Hello everyone, a very warm welcome to all of you to this webinar brought to you by ManageEngine. Wherever you are in the world, wishing you a very good day. Hope the day was good for people joining in your evenings or afternoons, and for people that are in the western part of the world, a very good morning to you. I am Rajesh Ganesan. I am Vice President Product Management at ManageEngine, and I am actually in Chennai in India. A very warm evening, and I'll be your host for this particular webinar. And today we are going to listen to Ian Madrigal, a very popular privacy activist, in particularly understanding what are the gray areas which companies face in terms of how to approach doing privacy right, especially for technology teams. So we are going to listen to Ian and learn a lot about how to do privacy right. And before we could do that, I'll just take a few minutes of your time to set the base for this webinar. So ManageEngine is part of Zoho Corporation, a company founded in 1996. And today we have three divisions. So one of which is ManageEngine, which was founded in 2001. Focusing primarily on delivering products for IT teams to manage their infrastructure, IT infrastructure, the technology infrastructure that runs most businesses today. And then we have the Zoho.com division, which was founded in 2005 to provide applications from the cloud to run any business. So these are business applications served entirely from the cloud that any business would need to run all of their operations. And our third division today, which was apparently our first, the Webnums division that focuses on delivering IoT solutions, Internet of Things solutions. How do you manage IoT infrastructure broadly? And that is the focus of Webnums division. Today we are more than 7,000 people that are part of Zoho Corporation that is spread around the world. We have more than 45 million users that are using all of our products, and we have sold to customers in more than 190 countries, right? And talking about ManageEngine alone, we have more than 2,000 dedicated employees with 200 channel partners around the world. We have sold to more than 180,000 customers. And what's more, we have 90 different products from ManageEngine, helping IT teams, the teams that own and run technology in businesses, provide all these tools to help them manage the technology infrastructure. As you could see here, we have broad suites of products for all aspects of running and managing your IT. My point really here is not to give a sales pitch, but to drive the point that despite being in technology business for more than 2 decades, building hundreds of products, serving literally millions of users, when it came to understanding and doing privacy, understanding various laws, regulations around privacy, it's always been challenging for us at ManageEngine and at Zoho Corporation. And even though our business model is never around ads, we have a lot of free products, but we were very, very clear that our business model would not be around serving ads. And despite all of these things, understanding and doing privacy has always been a challenge. And especially in the last 12 or 18 months, we have clearly realized privacy is not a one-time mandate. It's an ongoing mission, right? It was definitely not about meeting a May 25, 2018 deadline for GDPR. That's not how privacy should be approached, right? It has to be understood fundamentally and built into the design, and every aspect of business function should be privacy aware and should have all the necessary controls to do privacy right. And how did we do that? We actually started by talking to the experts, and this is exactly what I would recommend any one of you joining today to learn about how to do privacy do, right? So start by talking to an expert, and that's exactly the reason we are happy to bring Ian into doing this particular webinar. Ian is from Washington, DC in the USA. He's a lawyer by profession and also a very, very popular privacy activist. And I'm very happy to invite Ian to take us through the next 40-45 minutes, educating us about how to do privacy for the IT teams, the teams that run technology in companies. Over to you now, Ian. Thank you so much for being here. And a very good morning to you.
Good morning to you, yes. Great, so I will go into basically the agenda for the day. But let me see here, let me get my screen shared. There
yes,
we go.
I did, yes.
Wonderful. Yeah, so I want to set out just a little bit of an agenda, and then I'll go into a little bit more background on who I am. If you're not as familiar with me by name, you might recognize me from things I've done. So first of all, welcome everyone. Really appreciate folks coming into the webinar today. Today we're going to focus on the importance of consumer rights and data privacy in tech. We're going to look at the GDPR protections as a model for best practices that companies should adopt. I'm going to offer just some practical tips for tech professionals at all levels of how to implement this into your daily work. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the future of data privacy in an increasingly digital world. As Rajesh suggested, I think this is really an issue that is becoming more and more important. And like he said, it's a daily practice. It's not a one and done kind of issue. And then at the end, we'll have some time reserved for questions and discussion. So I just want to point folks, you can type questions as I'm presenting, as things come to you into the GoToWebinar control panel, and I can start to answer those at the end. So don't feel like you have to try to remember things through the whole presentation. All right, so first, let me introduce myself. As Rajesh mentioned, I'm a lawyer by training. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I direct campaigns for nonprofits focused on corporate accountability and consumer protections. I've actually done most of my work around the issue of forced arbitration, which I'll talk a little bit about, and actually its privacy implications as well. A lot of my activism is focused on financial and tech issues. So my previous actions have targeted Wells Fargo, Google, Facebook, and Equifax with creative activism and stunts. So I'm now best known as Monopoly Man. That stunt was inspired by a fight against forced arbitration. This was actually in the days after Equifax was exposed for putting 143 million Americans' most private data out there through a breach. And Congress had called the CEO to come testify. And I'd been working on this issue of forced arbitration for a while. And just for folks who aren't familiar, forced arbitration is basically when deep in the terms and conditions, companies bury what's known as an arbitration clause. And it essentially says that if the company exposes your data, if they rip you off somehow, if there's anything you might want to sue them for in court, you can't go through the court system. Instead, you have to go to a private arbitration panel where they get to pick who decides the case, what rules apply. It's basically a private legal system that corporations can exploit. And in practice, it really means that a lot of consumers are never able to sue, aren't able to expose bad practices within corporations. We saw it with Wells Fargo. They used it to cover up their fake accounts. We saw Equifax try to use it in the aftermath of their data breach to get people to not actually sue them over it, even as people's personal data was just out there. So we had a lot of trouble explaining that to people because obviously it's a complex subject. It's very legalistic. But the way that we found that really resonated with people the most was calling it a get out of jail free card. And so the Monopoly imagery really naturally lent itself to that. And obviously it also helped expose these greedy CEOs and kind of the power dynamics that are at play with these companies. So I started with Equifax, but then the one that really took off. It went on the Today Show. There was an Ask Me Anything on Reddit that broke some records. People really seemed to respond to just that creativity and the humor used to expose these things instead of kind of the anger and sadness that we're often used to when it comes to protest. But the one that you all might know me for better is when I showed up last December behind Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, when he came to testify. And so I'm just going to play a short clip highlighting that work.
Thing one tonight. You may have heard there was a hearing today on the Capitol with the CEO of Google called by House Republicans on the Judiciary Committee who've been looking into allegations of liberal bias bias online. Now, it started out as most hearings do. Google CEO Sundar Pichai entered a packed room ready to face the assembled congressmen and women. But as soon as Pichai took his...
Oh, sorry about that. Sorry, didn't mean to stop that. Let me get us back where we were. Should be good.
The Monopoly man settled in right behind him, over his left shoulder. Look at that. It's actually an activist named Ian Madrigal, who also appeared at a 2017 hearing on the Equifax data breach, and at Mark Zuckerberg's Senate hearing in April, that time dressed as a Russian troll. The Monopoly man put on quite a show over the course of today's 3-hour hearing, adding a monocle to the costume at one point, holding up a bag stuffed with fake money, and at one point he upgraded the mustache to a supersized mustache, and then the old 4 mustaches at the same time gag. But the Monopoly man was actually not the most cartoonish character at today's hearing. No, that honor goes to most of the Congress people asking the questions. That's thing 2 in 60 seconds.
All right. So as you can, okay. Well, so as you can see, my career as a lawyer has taken a bit of a turn into some fun antics, but I think it actually really helps capture people's attention on these issues. It's very hard to get interviews when I'm talking about forced arbitration or consumer data privacy. It's a lot easier to get interviews when I can say, hey, I'm that Monopoly guy that embarrassed the CEO, and then you can get a pivot into talking about these issues. So I just want to highlight one other stunt that I'm known for that folks might recognize. This was when Mark Zuckerberg was called to testify about Facebook's data privacy practices. Specifically, this was in the aftermath of Cambridge Analytica, when it came out that Facebook had exposed user data to this company that was then using that to help try to sway the 2016 election. So as part of that, I decided not to do my traditional Monopoly man stunt, but go for a little bit of a different approach. And so for this one, I dressed up as a Russian troll. And I'm just going to show a quick little highlight of that. I don't want to show this whole video. But I think it helps show a little bit of what I do and the importance of it.
I actually got this Russian soccer scarf, a little bit like a Russian babushka, just to get it across.
Remember the Monopoly man who crashed a congressional hearing last fall on the Equifax data breach? That was Amanda Werner, a political activist who works at a progressive advocacy group in Washington. But today, they took the day off to attend Zuckerberg's hearing, once again in costume.
Hi, how are you? Evan, nice to see you. Thanks for having us. Tell me exactly what it is you're doing today.
So today I'm attending Mark Zuckerberg's testimony in front of the Senate Judiciary and Commerce Committees. And I will be going, with my signatures and some style.
So you're going to a committee hearing dressed as a Russian troll?
Yeah, I think it's appropriate, it's about Russian trolls.
Okay.
So what I tried to do is just kind of create a troll doll nude illusion. I actually originally considered mine a bodysuit. It's just like flesh colored, but I figured Senator Grassley would not be a fan of that. So I've got the shirt and the pants, and then I've got a little jewel for my belly button. I thought I was gonna have to make this. I thought I was gonna just buy a normal wig and put a bunch of hairspray and stuff, but turns out there are a lot of options for trolls on the go. Honestly, this is a really tiny wig. It's kind of like a child size, so it can't actually cover all my hair.
Oh.
So we're just gonna try to make it work.
How do you get into the hearing dressed like this?
I've always been able to get inside the room. It's more what happens when I'm on the inside. That's a big deal. So we'll see. Honestly, the key to doing this part is just not being embarrassed. And luckily, that's a skill I have. I actually got this Russian soccer scarf, a little bit like a Russian babushka, just to get it across. Oh yeah, this is 100 rubles. If you recall from my Monopoly Man stunt, I had a moment where I wiped my forehead with a $100 bill. So, the best comedians know to call back to their most popular material. There we are.
It's good. The jewel actually really makes it, I have to say. I was skeptical of the jewel until I see the whole thing put together.
No, yeah.
Why are you doing this?
There's a lot of reasons, but, one of the most personal ones is actually just this morning I found out that my data was exposed to Cambridge Analytica through this weird, personality quiz app. And so I'm one of the 87 million Facebook users whose privacy was violated. So I'm attending not only to, kind of call attention to this point, I'm also attending because I want to see what Zuckerberg says. This is how I choose.
All right. So we'll stop that there. But yeah, I want to, aside from the silliness and kind of the spectacle, I want to talk about the importance behind the work. And by the way, that last stunt was done under a previous name, just so you know, but obviously still the same person, still the same apartment. So I think people connect to my Monopoly Man stunts because consumers increasingly feel powerless against these giant corporations that control our data. As I mentioned, the Equifax data breach affected 143 million Americans, more than 2/3 of the adult population in the US. So the vast majority of folks that even have social security numbers, their social security numbers were exposed. And yet, even despite that, and despite a lot of the public pressure, part of which came from the Monopoly Man stunt, there was no new legislation passed. There were no criminal prosecutions filed against any of these executives. And so I think folks are feeling very frustrated. Our most private data is vulnerable, and the consequences are terrifying. And the thing that works, I think, about Monopoly Man is that it flips the traditional power dynamic and instead hits CEOs where they are most vulnerable. So we kind of get to see them, wriggling under the spotlight instead of us feeling constantly exposed. And because we have a lot of growing corporate power right now, particularly in the tech space, I mean, Silicon Valley is set up to become the new Wall Street. It really increases the need for smart and thorough regulations. So luckily, the European Union has passed the GDPR, which I think can serve for a model for other countries, but the US has not yet stepped into this space. A lot of other countries haven't started to regulate this space yet. And new data breaches and abuses are exposed pretty much constantly. So companies really need to step up and protect consumer data proactively. Consumers are becoming more interested in the issue. They're becoming more savvy. So protecting data is not just the right thing to do. It's also, I think, a smart business decision. I want to talk a little bit about what's at stake here. I think, first of all, under the GDPR, there's major liability if consumer data is exposed or misused, especially if you're operating in the European Union. It also could have unintended consequences on larger issues. Obviously, we saw with Facebook, they weren't intending to try to, give this data to Cambridge Analytica and potentially then to a Russian intelligence operation, but that's how the data got out. And so, there's evidence that it swayed potentially millions of Americans in an election that came down to 70,000 votes. So that's like one unintended consequence that probably no one saw coming, but had a really big effect. And I want to talk a little bit just about kind of small business versus large corporation. I assume there's probably a mix of folks listening to this, but I think even if your company is a small business, you are still a target for data theft. It's really important to think about these issues. Small businesses may be less likely targets, but you're also more vulnerable. There have been a lot of cases where small businesses have lost hundreds of thousands of dollars to cyber criminals. And while a corporation may be able to survive a data breach, that would shutter a smaller enterprise. So imagine if you're, robbing a store, you might be able to go against Walmart, and they might, you might be able to ultimately get a lot more money if you go after a Walmart. But if you instead go after the corner store, it might just be a lot simpler because they might not have as sophisticated of security or as good of a system in place. And then if you are at a large corporation where the major policy decisions are made by executives, I do still think that individual employees have a strong voice here, especially if you're an IT professional. You have the expertise necessary to spot dangers. You have a deeper understanding of how, the impact of poor data protections and how they can harm consumers. So like Monopoly Man, I encourage folks to speak truth to power by raising concerns with the company leadership before consumers get hurt. It might be intimidating to speak up, but companies tend to be very cautious when confronted with potential legal liability. So I think that's the really important thing to emphasize here, is that whatever it costs you up front, you're going to save in the back end by, being in a better position when something does happen, because it's pretty inevitable at this point that something will go wrong. So I hope today that folks come out of this webinar not only more aware of the need for strong data privacy protections, but also more empowered to speak up and take action within your company. So I want to get a little bit into the nitty gritty of the GDPR. We won't be going super deep, but I want to give folks just kind of an overview of the models and best practices that we can take from this regulation. So the GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulation. And again, that's out of the European Union. So all EU countries are part of this. It's the most important change in data privacy regulations in 20 years, which, you know, obviously like the history of tech is fairly short. We haven't really had the type of tech industry that exists today for more than 20 years, really for more than about 10 years. So I think this is really going to set the standard for regulations to come, and I do hope that a lot more countries will start putting through these laws. It's also important to note that this law went into effect on May 25th, 2018. So it is in effect today. All companies should be abiding by it. If your company doesn't already have a plan in place to comply with GDPR, you should be doing that right about now. And really, the GDPR is all about giving users control over how businesses collect and process their personal information, which I think is really important. It empowers the consumer in a lot of ways. So the basics of the GDPR. So organizations can collect personal data, but it can only be collected for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes. So basically, this means that companies can't further process personal data in a manner that's incompatible with these purposes. You can't do more with it than what you tell folks and what is clearly related to the product that you're giving. In addition, organizations can only collect personal data that's adequate, relevant, and limited to what's necessary for the intended purpose. So companies can't track, you know, location, contacts, photos, anything like that, unless it's actually relevant to the product at hand. Which, you know, is a big change, because right now there are a lot of apps and products that exist out there that really their only business model is that they're secretly mining data and selling it elsewhere. But I think moving forward, we're going to just need a better practice. Either consumers are going to have to pay for apps that, you know, provide them services, or we're just going to need to be more upfront and get consumer buy-in and opt-in of, like, you know, I'm trading you this service for this data that I'm collecting from you. And I think just having that transparency is going to be really important moving forward to creating a better marketplace all around. So the other parts of GDPR, sorry, there we go. So personal data must only be kept as long as needed to fulfill the original purpose. So again, you can't kind of hoard data, and this, I think, minimizes the risk of breaches like Equifax, where we just see such a broad swath of information exposed to hackers. And frankly, it also frees up space on your servers. I mean, obviously, this data is worth something, but it costs a lot of money to maintain it, and it costs a lot of money to have to pay penalties when you expose it. On that same note, data breaches under the GDPR must be immediately disclosed. And this is really important because a lot of data breaches we've seen in the past few years, we found out later that the company just sat on that information for weeks or months. In fact, with Equifax, which again was like social security numbers, like people's most private data, the thing that puts people the most at risk when it's exposed, Equifax waited 6 weeks to notify consumers after finding out that their data was compromised. Like, that's just an unconscionably long amount of time. And so I'm glad that the GDPR stepped in to make sure that that doesn't happen again. It also requires increased security protocols for sensitive data, including making data anonymous where needed. And I think that's really important. You know, data can be very valuable, can be very useful to just kind of analyze and figure out, you know, how to best serve your consumer base, but it doesn't always need to be linked to the actual consumer and the actual, you know, personal pieces of that. You can use it to analyze and figure out mathematical models of what will work best without actually, you know, having the person's information tied to that. And the other part of the increased security protocols is that only employees that have a legitimate need to access the data can have access to that. And I think that's also really important, where we're seeing giant tech teams and, you know, maybe all of the people in sales can access all consumer data when they actually don't need to have access to that information. So the other part of the GDPR, which I really appreciate as a consumer rights advocate, is it empowers consumers by granting them specific rights. So first of all, the most privacy-friendly settings must be the default, but then consumers can opt in to allow additional use of data. So it's all very transparent. It's all very, you know, protecting folks from the kind of forced arbitration stuff where just at the bottom of terms and conditions, you have these things built in that no one's ever going to read. I think this opt-in model is just a much healthier model to pursue. Consumers are also granted a right to know when their data is being collected, as well as how it's being used. Again, just transparency. Consumers can object to their information being used for things like direct marketing, for example, so you don't get those creepy kind of Facebook ads that we see ubiquitously in the US. Consumers are also granted a right to stop access to and modification of their personal data, and they can demand that it be erased. So, some people worry that this particular protection could have some bad consequences. For instance, that it could allow people to censor unflattering stories or content they disagree with, especially content written or created by other users. So, for example, especially if you're a media company, you want to be mindful of this balance. You want to allow people to get rid of their personal data, but you want to make sure that that doesn't turn into like censoring an unflattering story. Say, Elon Musk is upset that you've written something bad about him and he demands you take it down. We have to compare that to like an unflattering story versus like actual personal data, him being doxxed on the platform. But I think in general, when you're not talking about people who are public figures or something like that, it is good to just have a rule against, platform information being on the platform that you don't want there. And then in some cases, consumers are granted a right to request their personal data so they can transmit it to another company, which I think is also another really good feature. So the consumer at the end of the day owns their data and they can take it with them as they go. It doesn't belong to the company. So there are some concerns with GDPR that I think are important, and I do hope that this regulation is more of a starting point that will be improved. So for one, it's really a lot easier for big companies to comply. I think that applies across a lot of regulations, but here specifically because it is such a new requirement, companies haven't really been doing these things before, so it's obviously going to be costly to implement, to just even hire, the tech folks and the lawyers you might need to know what you need to do is going to cost some money. So I would argue that regulators should ease these compliance requirements on smaller companies, at least those that aren't a subsidiary of a large company, and then tailor the monetary penalties to the size of the company. Because one other issue is that under GDPR guidelines, companies face penalties equal to 4% of revenue, but the penalties start at 20 million euros. And if you're someone like me who's coming from the US, where companies rarely ever face any penalties for doing things wrong, I'm glad to see that these are serious penalties that will have an effect on how companies operate. But if you're a small company, a 20 million euro fine could easily destroy your business. And I do think that it's very important that any penalties are tied to what the company can pay, so that we're charging the Facebooks of the world more and charging the smaller startups a lot less. The other piece of it is that, any rule, any regulation is only as good as its enforcement. And folks worry that the GDPR in particular will be difficult and costly to enforce. So I just think it's important, even if, first of all, we need to value actually enforcing the law. So I hope that the EU is serious now that we have this regulation of making sure that people are working on it and monitoring it, so that people in the tech space take it seriously. But even if it's not as enforced as often as I would like to see it, I think it's really important that this regulation was even passed, because creating standards in the first place gives this model of best practices, especially in a previously unregulated environment like tech. It gives you kind of a starting point of where to go from, and hopefully companies can build on it from there. It's still really important for individual consumers to exercise their rights and be really vigilant when they're, using new technology. But companies should do their part to make tech a more consumer-friendly place. It doesn't always need to be kind of company versus consumer. It can be us working together. So that's the GDPR. I want to kind of transition into more practical tips of how you can use this, because I know there's a lot of very legal technical things to consider, and it might be hard to see how you can implement that in your daily life. But I think using the GDPR as a model and a baseline is really important and will get you very far. It's, first of all, if your company has international reach or wants to have international reach, you should already be adhering to these regulations. So I encourage folks on this webinar to look into that. And if you aren't doing that, go to your leadership immediately and remind them, there are severe legal penalties of breaking GDPR rules. I think that's probably the thing that's going to resonate most with executives who might want to, have cost savings and profit as the ultimate thing. Just remind them that legal liability is a very big issue, and it starts at 20 million euros. I think in general, when you're building data practices, we should operate from an opt-in mentality, like the GDPR requires. But I think it's also just, like I said, the most consumer-friendly thing, the thing that I think is going to build goodwill with your customer base, that will build user loyalty. That's really important. In general, I just don't think it's a good policy to build a business around tricking consumers. A lot of folks, like I said, are willing to kind of trade like this service you're offering me for free for this data I'm giving you. I think it's something that you should be willing to negotiate with your consumers. You can figure out how much they're comfortable with and how much, you're willing to lower the price or get rid of ads or anything like that in exchange for that data. This just really makes sure that it's a two-party conversation instead of the company unilaterally deciding for the consumer what's appropriate. Also, as with the GDPR, just don't collect data you don't need, especially personal information that would help hackers with identity theft. I think on the one hand, there's data that you might be able to sell or use or to improve the platform or something like that, but there's also data that really just isn't necessary at all. All of the questions that we have when people are trying to sign in, like using personal information for security questions, that often is unnecessary. It is often much more secure to just have, a strong password and good user identification system. But collecting people's mother's maiden name and things like that can be used against them if there is a data breach and that information is exposed. So I encourage people to just think about that, not only in terms of the data you're trying to monetize, but also the data that you're just using because it's kind of become a habit in this space. Then when you have that information, just really be careful about not keeping it any longer than you need to. You should regularly be purging your system of outdated information, put time limits on how long you keep that user data, especially when a consumer stops using your product. I'm mindful there are folks that might stop using your product for a few months and come back and then be upset when it's gone. I think that, again, it's just best to have as much communication with the consumer as possible. So you can go in and tell them, hey, in 2 months, we're going to be deleting this data. Like, let us know if you want to keep it or if you want to come back to our platform. Let people know when you're getting rid of it, but I still think it's important to get rid of it in a timely manner. Like, there are products I was using 10 years ago that I don't even remember what they're called today, and I don't need them keeping my data. I very much want them to purge any, weird posts I wrote when I was 20 years old. So just keep that in mind as you're building your product. And again, free up space on your servers, very important. And then within the company, I think it's really important to limit employee access to user data. So you want to make sure that only employees who need specific kinds of user data can have access to it. Again, just think of specific teams where it's actually important, or even specific, people in leadership on those teams. I think the more we can really restrict access, the better. And then also, when you are sharing that information with certain employees, just make sure that you're password protecting the computers and servers that are granting them access to that. And this is really important. Be sure to change those passwords whenever an employee leaves. There have been instances where an employee has, gone in and looked up their ex-girlfriend's information so that they could stalk her. Like, don't allow for things like that. Make sure you're only putting this in the hands of trusted employees. Make sure you're punishing any breaches when they do occur within your company. And then also, there's been instances of disgruntled employees who are mad at the leadership when they're leaving, and so on their way out, they expose a bunch of user data. You want to be really diligent. You should even be changing the passwords before you're letting anyone go or anything like that, so they can't do those things on the way out. And then when you are trusting certain employees with this data, especially those who aren't necessarily super tech savvy, like people on your sales team, or someone who's not an IT professional, make sure that those folks are really knowledgeable about best practices. They're going to need tips and training, especially the folks that travel often with company devices. You want to make sure that they know not to leave those things in public, not to type in a password in a really open space. And then I think just keep that education up regularly, especially for folks on your team that, again, aren't as tech savvy, aren't thinking through these things in the way that you are. I think it's important to try to organize quarterly or even monthly meetings to train employees of like the newest fraud schemes, strategies to avoid phishing attempts. I mean, we saw this again in 2016 in the US when John Podesta on Hillary Clinton's team, was scammed by a phishing email. And there are just always going to be folks in your team that aren't as well versed in those things, aren't as savvy at spotting scams. And so just regularly reminding them that these scams are out there and to think twice and give them some kind of strategies, I think can be really helpful. Again, similar to the GDPR, I think it is a very important best practice to notify users promptly when their data has been compromised. Even if you're not in the EU, I think US companies should be doing this as well. Other companies should be doing this. And there's obviously a balance here. Like, it's going to look bad for the company if there's a data breach, but I think it really does look a lot worse to wait and try to cover it up. And the important piece too is it can land the company in legal trouble. Even if you're not under the GDPR, if you show that you waited 6 weeks like Equifax and then that caused damage to consumers, that's something that they can then, sue you over, or you can face penalties over. I think it's really important, not just on kind of a moral level, but also on a practical level, because timely notification allows customers to take steps to defend themselves. And you don't always know what the situation is going to be. You don't know. You might think that this data is really innocuous, but in this one person specific situation, it can actually be really dangerous to expose. And so giving the consumer the power to take whatever steps they need to protect themselves, I think is really important. You don't want to kind of decide for them what's best. Then within your company, I think it's really important for folks that care about these issues and that really understand the potential for harm here, to advocate within your company for better data practices. And I know that that's hard. Again, I think, you need to be really clear and firm when pushing better data practices. And the more clearly you can call in your own expertise to explain the real life impact of your company's policies on users, the more likely executives will be to hear you out and respond. And again, I think emphasizing the company's legal exposure, any harm it may have to the bottom line, the profit margin, is really important, and probably what we'll get through more than, kind of general, like, this is the right thing to do. Executives in particular are kind of called on to be focused more on the bottom line. And so if you can speak that language to explain why these things are important, I think that really helps. And just remember that users value privacy. This is an actual thing that is increasing the value of your product for them. It's making them more loyal. It's making them want to keep working with you. And especially as data breaches increase, which I think they've been doing lately, consumers are becoming more sensitive to this. I think for the first few years of this tech boom, we've kind of just been excited by all of the shiny things, but people are starting to become a lot more savvy now. They can, they know which products they can choose between. And I think companies are going to see a lot more consumers leaving if they don't start to treat their data with these stronger protections. So again, like, these data practices are a feature. They are something to attract people to your company. And I think you need to remind executives at your company that these protections attract new users and strengthen your reputation. And they really do have benefits that aren't, necessarily going to be seen in the immediate profit margin, but will grow in the future. And then lastly, I just want to emphasize, I think it's really important, if executives do ignore your concerns and user privacy is seriously at risk, I would encourage you to consider reaching out directly to your legal department. They will understand more than anyone the consequences of exposing user data, and they may have more influence over executive decisions than you do. I know, again, that's scary. It puts you at a little bit of personal risk, but I think especially in extreme situations, we have to not be afraid to blow the whistle on bad practices within the company. Hopefully, especially if you go to the legal team, I think the legal team will have your back. But even in situations where you might end up, having to find a new job, if you're saving 143 million Americans' personal data from being exposed, I think that's well worth it. And frankly, I would be happy to help, make sure you land somewhere good. So that's the end of the practical tips. I want to just talk a little bit about the future of data privacy. And then I'm going to hand it back to Rajesh, and we'll start to take questions after he talks a little bit more. But I just think it's really important to contextualize this. Like, tech is only going to become a bigger aspect of daily life in the coming decades. We've seen just how many facets of our lives it's taken over in the past few years. And it really tends to expand exponentially. So as more data is collected over our lifetimes, it's really going to be more and more important to folks. We're going to be living more of our lives online. And so it won't just be like, oh, well, my address is on there, my social security number is on there. It's going to be like, no, my entire life is on there. And it's going to have really big consequences for people if that gets exposed. So we really can't allow tech to operate like the Wild West as it has for this long. Governments have a big role to play here. That's definitely, what I try to do. I try to get them to actually be active in this issue and pass legislation and regulations. But tech companies should be proactive and show that they can be responsible with consumer data, even without the legal consequences that might come along. I think an important piece of this also is ending monopolies in the tech space. We've seen Facebook and Google become less responsible with people's data as they've taken more power in the space, because they just know that even if there's a bad news story about them, users aren't really going to be able to avoid coming in contact with their products. And so that's a really important thing. The more competition you have in this space, the more companies have to actually take these things seriously. And so I will definitely be fighting for a better regulated tech space, more room for smaller companies to come up and challenge these big entrenched tech monopolies. Because that also just gives consumers a choice in how to best use how to use the best products and companies that have a greater incentive to actually protect their data. This is really important to me because I think at its best, tech enables connection and the sharing of ideas. Consumers are using these products to organize, to build power, to stand up for their rights. I mean, most of my stunts would not have been possible were it not for Twitter and Facebook and Google. And yet I'm kind of using these tools, to help make a fairer space for consumers within these companies. But tech should be our ally in this fight. I don't want them to be the enemy. I would rather work with companies if they are, going to ally themselves with consumer rights. But regardless of what, approach tech companies take here, I'm always going to be here to amplify the voices of consumers as Monopoly Man. And I really appreciate you all giving me this space to talk a little bit about it. I'm going to hand it over to Rajesh again in just a minute. And then after he's done talking, we'll take some questions and talk about any other issues you want to dig further into.
All right, thank you very much, Ian. So that was a lot of insights, more than the GDPR basics, right? So what was more valuable was your practical tips on how people working in technology should approach doing privacy, because most people that actually want to learn about GDPR, they grasp the basics really well. But where people get stuck is how to go about implementing it, right? So that's where your tips were really, really useful. And I also take the next 5 or 6 minutes to sort of share our perspective of how our journey was in terms of understanding this particular regulation and bringing in this culture of privacy into our company, right? So what is ManageEngine doing about privacy compliance, or we as a company, Zoho Corporation, how did we approach our stand towards privacy? It all started somewhere in 2016 when GDPR was approaching very fast. And we always adopted this business model of having to be extremely privacy friendly. We really respected users' privacy. We really, really were careful in sharing our customer data to third parties. And this was also the right time when GDPR was knocking on everybody's door, every business's door by 2016 timeframe. That's when we also organized ourselves. We had a legal team, we had a security team, we have a compliance team, but this is also the time we had to form a focused, dedicated privacy team, which was also staffed by people from multiple different functions. We really needed seasoned developers being part of this team, because you just bring people that understand law and regulation and privacy fundamentals without any perspective of how software is built. It's actually not going to help. So this particular team was staffed with people from multiple different functions, people who understood software development, people who understood engineering, people who understood marketing. So this was actually a mix of teams, and we have an organizational level data protection officer who has a lot of experience building software products. So this made a huge difference. And this privacy team actually complemented all our other functions, like I talked about, the legal, the security team, the compliance team, right? And this central team, their primary focus was to learn, research more about, do a lot of audits internally, learn from our own use cases on how to do privacy. And more than internal factors, their learnings came a lot from researching cases from other companies who went through privacy violations, right? So Ian mentioned frequently about Equifax. There is a very good US government study about what really went wrong with Equifax, and that serves as a very, very good reference point, guidebook for any company to really know what mistakes they could actually be doing themselves, right? So it's a very good point where you could start learning about how not to do things, and also like clearly know from the recommendations how to do things right. So where do you start from, and how do you do these things, and where do you go, right? So the whole focus of the central privacy team is to bring in this culture of privacy in this company, make sure people are aware of the importance, give them the learning, do frequent audits. But one of the important decisions we also took is not to leave 100% of privacy to this one team, right? So this has to actually propagate across the entire company. And that was a very, very conscious decision that we took, that there would be one central team driving privacy activities that every other team, every other function that is part of Zoho Corporation would be doing. And these are the top 6 points when it comes to privacy we give a lot of importance to. The first point is privacy by design and default. This is actually a very important clause in GDPR itself, and more country-specific laws are emphasizing this particular point as the most important. So what do you mean by privacy by design and default? It's very specific to each business, the way they do things, the way they use technology. I'll give specific examples for each, like what does privacy by design means to Zoho Corporation. So when we approach privacy, we took a very important call. We said we will not allow any third-party cookies or any third-party tracking in our website or in our cloud web applications. This is a very, very important design and default decision that we took, because before this decision, we used to have Google's tracking code in our websites. This was extremely helpful for the marketing team to learn users' behavior on our websites, and that was very crucial for our business. Not only that, all our cloud applications, we had third-party tracking code to understand how our customers were using our products. That was extremely important input for a product management team. But at the same time, what this also meant was we are sharing information about our customers to third parties, possibly without the knowledge of our own customers. And we decided this was completely against our stand of doing privacy right. And we decided absolutely no third-party tracking or no third-party tracking code. So what we are doing is building our own tools. We track, but that data never ever leaves our system ever. It never goes to any third party. This is how you do privacy by design and default. So this is something we give a lot of importance to. And the next point I talked about, it's not going to be like one central privacy team that is going to make sure the entire business complies to all the privacy laws and regulations, right? So you could actually see CEOs giving interviews. We are going to hire thousands of privacy experts to make sure we focus on privacy. And in my belief, at least personal belief, that's not going to work. It has to actually go into every person that is part of the business who understands the grassroots of privacy and how they do operations. So actually what we do, we have a team level or a department level DPOs, and these are people who have very high accountability. We do not appoint DPOs at a team level just for the sake of having somebody, right? This would probably be the department head or a person who has spent more than a decade in the company, or somebody with a role that has very high accountability. Because when it comes to privacy, you want people that are accountable, responsible, taking over this particular function. So these are tips that you listeners listening to this could also follow in terms of how you go through your journey of making sure you comply to all these privacy regulations. And the third important point that we emphasize across the company is risk-driven development. Any activity you do, it could be sales team like that is on the field, marketing team doing a lot of campaigns. It could be the marketing team again doing a lot of experiments in terms of generating leads. You got to understand the risks of leaking personal data. It could be the personal data of employees, it could be of your customers, your partners, your agencies, right? So how do you sort of educate risks to users, right? So different teams use different language, and that is the next point, right? Using the right language within to educate privacy. So the privacy team, the legal team, the compliance team, they understand all the jargons, but when you go and talk to a marketing team, they probably do not immediately understand all the privacy jargon. So what we do, so we have privacy scores for every team in our company. So each team, when they actually do privacy well, when they understand the importance of users' private information, customers' private information, and are proactive, we award points. Similarly, when they act where they are not aware of the importance and they end up leaking data somewhere, it could be some printed out sheets left near the printer that the person was not careful to come and take, which could have some customers' PII data, right? So in this case, we penalize the team. And what is the language we talk? We tell them the penalty is for the next 2 days, you will not be able to export any customer or lead information from the CRM system, right? This is how you talk your language to your people to make sure they understand privacy really, really well. And the next point, leading to the next point, every privacy control that you have in terms of process or process steps, your methodologies or your tools, it should have automation. Again, for example, what we do, we have our own code check-in. When developers write code and try to check it in, there will be an automated tool that will be looking for any violations of privacy in terms of how does it handle users' private information? Is it encrypting all those information? Is the code obfuscating really all the private information of users, right? So it looks for all these patterns and then flags users. We also have developed a chatbot. Zoho has a product called Zoho Click, which is used as the internal communication system. And when people chat with each other or on a group chat, when somebody types in information that appears to be somebody's personal information, like people are typing phone numbers or email IDs or somebody's address, a bot would automatically pop up and say, this looks like somebody's personal information. Are you really sure you want to share it at this point, right? So it is not just enough to train people, to teach people, but also have these sort of intelligent automation in all your controls. So by time people automatically get what is important, right? So even though they sit through classroom training, they do not understand what personal information is. But when you have a system that contextually tells them that this is personal information that you're not supposed to share, they learn it much, much better, right? So these are some of the things you could also try in your environment. And finally, not the least, but not the least important, one of the important emphasis that we have is to have a very, very thorough and detailed activity register being maintained, right? So whenever there is a security incident or a privacy incident in terms of leakage of privacy information, because of our structure, we are 7,000 people, you tend to have hierarchies. Often, even the person who is responsible for that activity, often they do not know what really happened. So one of the important thing is the RACI matrix, where we make sure every person lists all the tasks that they ever do, right? Again, software developers, they list 20 or 25 of their routine tasks. When it comes to marketers, each one of them lists what they do. So even when something happens, you would be able to go and see who is the responsible person. that the privacy team can approach and continue the investigation. So these are some of the areas that are part of our daily life in Zoho Corporation that has allowed us to focus a lot in terms of doing privacy really right. And this is also our approach. So like we have a bottoms-up approach of doing privacy. We start with this central privacy team that I talked about. They come up with our strategy. They emphasize the importance of doing privacy by design and privacy by default. Then we have a good organizational level structure. We have a central structure who is driving the whole operation, but also a completely decentralized team of people that actually implements all those processes, right? So that is also like in place. And the third important thing is to have the right policies and procedures, and that comes to us, as I said, from the central team in their research of both internal and external incidents that happen around all the time. And the most important thing is also training and awareness. We do periodic audits, periodic training in terms of how teams fare. We also award them points in terms of where they rank in terms of other departments and functions inside the organization. So following that comes our periodic external audits and certifications. So we definitely do every quarter a security audit and privacy audit. And finally, we also maintain a very thorough data processing inventory of all the data that we ever have. And not only that, we take all these learnings into the products that we have built in a ManageEngine. As you could see in some of the screenshots here, you have Desktop Central, a product that manages the life cycle of the entire endpoint devices. Could be laptops, mobile phones. You have a very focused privacy settings. And then here you see a product called Service Desk Plus. This is used as the IT service management operation center. It allows you to do your general IT service desk operations like your ticketing, service request management, your change management, all the IT processes. That has a specific section to make sure all the information you have in this application is adhering to all the privacy requirements. Also a product called Password Manager Pro. All of these products, very contextual, have all the privacy controls built in. And this not only applies to these three products, all the products in the ManageEngine suite. So they actually inherit all the knowledge and the experience that we have over the last few years of doing privacy. And I encourage you all to go take a look at ManageEngine.com, go through these products. So where they not only help you with general IT management problems, but also would help you give the right perspective on privacy and also help you do your privacy operations right. And with this brief, I'll just allow control back to Ian to see if there are any questions directed at Ian, so Ian could answer you directly. I'm transferring control back to you, Ian. Please
sure.
Take control.
Sure. Yeah, I don't have anything left on the webinar, but I can definitely just transfer questions here, or take any questions here. I don't see any that have come up in the webinar yet, but if folks want to type in any questions.
Yeah, I see a question. So is it
great.
not harmful? Is it not harmful to transfer data from one company to other? That's a question I see. You can take that question first, and if I have any more answer, I'll also chip in.
Sure. Yeah. I think, if the important point here is that you're transferring the data with the user asking you to do that. So you're not just kind of transferring it to whichever company you want. You're doing it with the full consumer's knowledge and consent. And I think that's where it's really important. And also, under the GDPR, the idea as well would be that they can choose which information is given. So it might not be like, their entire user data from everything they've ever done in your product, but it might be the important things they need to transfer over just to make that easier. So I don't think you'd run into those security concerns, and at the very least, because it would be the consumer's decision to do that, it would be up to them to kind of balance those interests against each other.
Exactly. So a point I may add, a specific example I took of Google's tracking code. Google Analytics is an extremely important tool for marketers, But once the data goes to Google, and Google have their own terms and conditions, and whenever that changes, our liability to our customers also is in question, right? And you, as a company, you should be absolutely be aware of what are the third parties you are sharing data with, and for what purpose. It's basically that clarity is very, very important. So we cannot say it is harmful. There is no black and white answer here. So you have to be really be aware of what the third party is doing with your data, and your liability to your customers that are coming to your website or using your web application.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we just crossed the our stipulated time of 60 minutes for this webinar. So thank you very much, Ian, again. So I absolutely enjoyed doing this with you. So we have more questions, but we will answer that over email to the people who have asked these questions. But for now, thank you so much, Ian. If you have any closing words, please go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And feel free also to take any questions me over on Twitter. I'm at Ian S. Madrig, which I think is also linked in the presentation. Feel free to also just search Ian Madrigal or Monopoly Man, and I'll probably pop right up. So happy to answer questions on there as well. And thanks to everyone today for tuning in, and hope to keep this conversation going.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining this webinar and asking all these questions. I hope the webinar was really useful. And as Ian said, please feel free to reach out to any of us at ManageEngine. My contact is here. Rajesh05 is my Twitter handle. So if you have any follow-up questions, any clarifications, do feel free to reach out to me as well. And thank you so much, and you all have a very good day. Thank you very much. Cheers. Bye.
Take care, everybody.